2 points I'd make. Firstly, I'm not really qualified to give the closing speech here. And secondly, I'm standing between you, the audience, and supper or the pub. So I'm going to make it brief. I think it's been an informative day. We've discussed at length how the COVID-19 is, or our responses to it, have probably caused more harm than good. For example, the 7 million on the waiting list for the NHS, thanks to monomania within the NHS. How the UK has spent the best part of £500 billion on subsidies of one sort or another, track and trace and all the rest of it, and how the terrible toll on children's education and so forth. I wanted to talk for just a minute or two about the Hong Kong influenza, which I looked into in 1968-70, which you could argue has been, or was as deadly as COVID-19. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, there were between 1 and 4 million deaths worldwide from it. We don't know because a lot of them took place in China and the stats from then don't exist. The global population then was half what it is now. And so we've had roughly 4 million deaths apparently from COVID. So the deaths that took place from the Hong Kong flu were, relative to population size, comparable. But in 1968, society carried on as normal. Almost all schools, churches, universities, businesses, theatres, public transport and shops stayed open the entire time everywhere. There was no lockdown, no social distancing, no mask wearing. Things like the Woodstock Festival hosted 400,000 people in highly unsanitary conditions in 1969. There was no hysteria in the media about the illness. No propaganda from government designed to scare the citizens senseless. International travel wasn't halted. There were no quarantines. In many ways, it was worse than COVID. And I'll tell you for why. One specific important reason. The Hong Kong flu struck children and infants, as well as the elderly. And I think that makes it such a worse disease. In many ways, it was almost as contagious as COVID, but the entire epidemic is treated as an academic footnote. In fact, getting detailed facts about the Hong Kong flu 52 years ago are really hard. So why did we behave so differently this time? I think we now have an entire public health industrial complex which has developed, which is almost willing a pandemic to hit the world. For many public health specialists, I'm afraid to say, this is their moment of fame and glory. I think digital media has exacerbated and enabled this pandemic. Viral video of chaos, or apparent chaos, in northern Italian hospitals in February 2020 scared the public and the authorities witless. And I think it led very directly to universal lockdowns in the West. I think online news, social media, 24-hour TV stations fed a morbid appetite for grim daily updates. And I think we meekly complied with universal house arrest. Of course, half the workforce were enabled to work from home. And so 15 million people could continue to earn a living under lockdown, stay in touch and order food from online grocers. Admittedly, 10 million people still had to go out to work. But interestingly, one of the other big reasons that I think has not been focused upon, in 1968, interest rates were 6%. It would have cost too much for the governments to borrow the trillions of debt that they've taken on now to pay all the bills for these huge interventions like furlough, tax holidays and so forth. And of course, society is older and more obese now, so probably a higher proportion of the population now feel vulnerable to a new and strange disease. And we are, as you've heard today, much more obsessed about health and safety. And institutions tend to adopt the dreaded precautionary principle at every opportunity. And safetyism has become almost a modern religion. I think we have become so much more risk averse as a society. And of course, organizations are very fearful of litigation and reputational damage. There have been these extraordinary responses to the COVID pandemic, none of which took place then, from lockdowns in a draconian fashion, ignoring or neglecting the vast collateral damage, copying the Chinese Communist Party, this mass testing of infections on an industrial scale using this novel testing technology, the ready acceptance of significant asymptomatic spread of the disease, extensive wearing of masks, which we've talked about, and then fundamental to all of it, I think, in a way, the authorities quite deliberately downplaying the fact that the one absolute known from the beginning, which is maintained throughout it, is that the disease is essentially a negligible threat to young, healthy people, pretending that we're all in this together, knowing that the average median age of victims is around 80 and that 95% of them have a serious comorbidity. None of that would have been acceptable, I think, in previous generations. And of course, I think what has influenced behavior, for example, testing, is that there were some very serious mistakes made by the authorities in this country early in the pandemic. For example, the decanting of untested geriatric patients from hospitals into care homes to protect the NHS, which led to the rapid spread of the disease amongst vulnerable populations. And I also think that we're in denial about the significant nosocomial spread of COVID in hospitals. I think at least a third of those who died were infected either in care homes or hospitals. And I think a lot of the government's response has been because of that fact. Now, ultimately, of course, we have become a less stoic, more sentimental society over the last 50 years, and more hypochondriac, and less able to deal with death and mortality than we used to be. I think, frankly, we are more decadent and self-indulgent than we used to be. 50 years ago, in 1968, there were millions who had fought and remembered World War II. They understood better, I think, than we do now, the importance of defending everyday liberties and making the most of life in the face of sudden death. And I think that as we examine over the coming months and years the collateral damage that lockdowns have caused, and indeed the fear and social distancing, and we've heard a great deal about that in terms of cancer, heart disease, mental illness, suicides, and all the economic harms of bankruptcies, evictions, and so forth, and the tax and debt that we've racked up, school problems, overdoses, and so forth, we will realize in time that terrible mistakes have been made. So, trying to end on a more positive note, how do we recover from this? I think firstly, and I said this earlier, we have to lose the fear. The authorities and, frankly, the media have to stop scaring the population senseless. Reporting on this single illness has to get more in proportion. Too many people, I suspect millions, are simply too frightened to return to their real lives, but are existing in a weird state of sort of hypochondria and anxiety. And our political leaders and our public scientists have to stop the focus on COVID and discuss our overall well-being. Next time, and indeed now, we do need a better cost-benefit analysis for all these measures to assess the impact this time and in the future. People need to be more trusted over their own safety and to take measures which they feel comfortable about. And I think the advisors to the government need to be reformed very profoundly. They should include not just clinicians and scientists, but also people like economists, people like philosophers, and people like entrepreneurs, in order to give a broader view of the consequences of severe restrictions by the government, unprecedented in our everyday lives. I do think there must be better protection of basic liberties and more robust measures to, for example, ensure that Parliament can function properly if there is another pandemic, which we all know it absolutely has not in the last 16 months. Parliament's failed to scrutinise and provide the checks and balances since March 2020, such that it has felt like a one-party state most of the time. And we need thorough investigations into the various approaches taken to the pandemic across different places, such as, for example, why Sweden, have they done well or badly? What can we learn about the approach adopted in places like Florida? I think probably we need to focus more on measures like ventilation, which has been pretty neglected. I think we need to consider the idea that we don't have sufficient ICU capacity in this country in the NHS, and therefore we have to build that. And that isn't just Nightingale hospitals, that is staff. More doctors and more of the right nurses trained, and that takes time and investment. But I think it's essential if we think this sort of episode will happen again. I do think we have to stop the testing mania now and never adopt it again, because I think what's happened is it's become a justification in itself for those who are probably benefiting. I do think that despite all the criticism, not from me but others, focused protection had a lot of sense to it, because I think they would have protected the care homes and the vulnerable better if they had said these are the people who really are at high risk, rather than protecting everyone with a universal lockdown. I think seasonality and natural immunity have been dismissed, and I think that's been fundamentally wrong throughout. I think it is now generally accepted that it is a grave mistake to shut schools ever, and that must never happen again, because I think, as you've heard earlier, the children in many ways are the biggest victims of all this. And I think we do need a bigger societal conversation about who is at risk during these times, and about all the uncertainties. And I think there is pretty epic arrogance from a lot of the so-called experts as to what they really know and what they don't, and the certainties and all the uncertainties of what we've been through. So I think there is much to be done. I fear that Monday, although it will give us some of our freedoms back, isn't the end of the tale, and that we must steel ourselves for continued efforts to try and ensure that society is better informed, better prepared for further waves or other viruses, and that society as a whole doesn't lose its senses again, which it some days feels like it has this time round. Anyhow, thank you all for sacrificing your Saturday on a very sunny day, and enjoy the rest of your weekends.
Luke, thank you very much. I think that was an incredible summary, really, of what everything we've covered here today, the key issues, and a recognition that we need to learn the lessons from the response to COVID-19. Our objective today was simple: to critically evaluate the global response and to start to explore how we can move forward and responsibly live with the virus, and to move forward beyond the pandemic so that we can resume normality. Today began with a simple question: is now the time for a better solution? And I think the consensus amongst all of our speakers and our panelists today is that a resounding yes, it is time for a new and better solution and for us to move forward. However, as we've also seen today, there are a lot of unanswered questions, and there are a lot of bigger questions that need broader and wider debate. We've seen debate in the room today, but where has that debate been? It is time to restore the principles that underpin public health, that underpin science, and underpin the way that we govern and rationalize our societies and economies moving forward. Our objective really today was to start to ask these questions so that we can widen that debate. And it's down to each of us today to take the lessons that we've learned and share them with others. Because as we know, the mainstream media around us, whilst the tide is beginning to turn and the press are starting to ask questions of their own, it is down to us to provoke and stimulate those questions and involve all of society. Because if we live in a world of us and them, what society do we really have? I do believe it's time for us to come together and ask that question together: is now the time for a better solution, and how do we move that forward? I would love to thank every one of our guests who are here today, our guest speakers. We've had 18 speakers throughout today to give a concise overview of the key issues and some really interesting discussions around how we can move forward. I want to thank everyone who's joined us here physically at the summit live in London, and the thousands and thousands of people who have watched live at home around the world. Thank you for your engagement, your participation, and sharing. And I want to say a huge thank you to the enormous amount of work that is the team behind this who have put this together over the last few weeks and months. We assembled a small team with no budget whatsoever. with an ambition to start to open up this debate and this discussion, and it's culminated in what you've seen here today. I want to say a special thank you to Mariam, who's project managed and ran the event for us and all the way through this. I want to say thank you to Sai and the event crew today, who've done an incredible job of running the event and keeping us on time and running smoothly. I want to say a huge thank you to Costello AV, who have enabled us not only to have incredible experience here in the room, but also to share it with thousands around the world. Please say thank you to our AV team. And a special mention to Dan Haylock, who came up with the brand. On having developed a previous brand, we changed overnight how the direction was going to go and invested all of his next day building it. So thank you to Dan for all the visuals we've seen here today. And it would be remiss of me not to say thank you to my wife, who's been a constant source of support throughout this. I was going to bring her on stage, but she has a little bump. And the real reason I'm doing this here today is for the future. It is not just to tackle what we've seen here today, the issues. To me, it's really about the future. What future do we want to create? I began this day by saying, I believe that this is a decade of positive change. And we're on a trajectory where that may not be quite the way that we see it unfold. But it's down to us to change that trajectory from here forth. It's down to us. The power to change the world is truly in our hands. And I want to leave you on that note, to go out there, share the messages that you've learned today, and be part of the change that you wish to see. Thank you very much for being with us today. Good night.